Live on Zoom. Are you sharing? Do it 2 times. I'm getting ready to unmute. So that was smooth. That actually worked out fantastic. If everybody is lost, don't worry about a thing because you are in the right place at the right time. It is SIP episode 57. Hello, Sipsters. Welcome to Friday. Chad Angelo here, winemaker out of Napa. Christopher Palm, Eric and Lauren Klein. That's got to be week 21 or so in a row for you, Jan Kiefer. Jeff and Jane Greasy from the recovery couch with the brace pillow. Is that what that's called, the brace pillow? Jim Brubaker, Mark Salazar, Peter Glick, Scotland Kiefer. Scotland, this is a special night for you because we actually referred to this last week. When you get to open up 2 bottles of wine in one event, we just call that a Scotland. Because you don't need a reason to open up 2 bottles of wine. You just open up 2 bottles of wine. Tom Danchik, nice to see you, sir. I am looking forward to this right now because it is a special episode featuring Zinfandel. We're going to dive deep in Zinfandel with a pro on Zinfandel and someone that has been near and dear to Cellar Angels for many moons. He got to know us, 2011 or so. And probably much to his surprise, he has stuck by us. And it is without reservation, we look at an opportunity to partner with Inspiration Vineyards and specifically John anytime we can get to it. And I want to let people know that we're going to go deep into Zinfandel tonight. So we're excited about that. John has been, this has been in John's family for a long time. So without further ado, let me introduce you to John Phillips, the Vigneron owner, founder of Inspiration Vineyards, and the guest host of episode 57 on SIP. John, good to see you again.
Well, it's awesome being here, and I want to thank everybody, including, you guys, Martin, Denise, and hello, all of you Sipsters. It's good to be here, and also share one of my longtime passions, which is Old Vine Zinfandel and comparing that with new Zinfandel. So this is cool. I need to get some wine in my glass, I guess.
Yeah, you do. That's rule number 1. I think it's interesting too, because Zinfandel is probably, and I don't have the Harvard Business Review white paper to prove this, but my guess is Zinfandel has been the gateway drug for people, or actually rather white Zinfandel for people getting into wine. It is historically one of the first wines they try is white Zinfandel. And I'm actually gonna go right to a poll question right off the bat to let people know if they've got their thinking caps on a Friday. So white Zinfandel, famous home that is near the Napa Valley. Is it made from the same grape as all red Zinfandels? True or false?
You can't let me vote. This is just horrible.
That's by design.
I guess so. Yeah.
So we're gonna give this 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. First poll question out of the box. We've got a lot of people choosing true. 1 person choosing false. I think Denise said, I don't know. Either way, I'm drinking it. That might have been her vote. The trues have it. white Zinfandel is made from the same grape as all red Zinfandels. It's actually pretty interesting that white Zinfandel kind of has a bad name. It's got low alcohol. It's sweeter than we would normally potentially like. Interestingly enough, it's still 6% of all grocery store wine sales is white Zinfandel. I mean, it's pretty high. But this typically is the gateway to Zinfandel or to wine rather. And then you start to go into the Cabernets, the Merlots, and all the other varieties. But John, Zinfandel has been near and dear to you for a long, long time. Tell us kind of your history and why it's something that you gravitate towards.
So one of my very first jobs for a winery was working for the Mirasu family in South San Jose. And they had a couple of old vineyard properties that they inherited that had Primitivo and Zinfandel planted on it. One of them was the Cribari Estate Winery, which again, that brand is long gone. And the vineyards are gone as well. A lot of houses and golf courses are now where Old Vines once stood. But, you know, we would get off work and we would go into that property, and there were a couple of old wine warehouses there with huge redwood tanks, and we would siphon off, you know, Petite Syrah and Zinfandel. And Mirasu also at that time made a wonderful Santa Clara County Zinfandel. And I just wish I still had bottles of it today, because it's probably one of the best Zinfandels that I have ever had in my life, that I can ever even remember. It was low in alcohol, also lots of robust flavors, and it came from old vines. And so it's probably one of the first red wines that I ever started drinking before I became a winemaker.
Well, and you just mentioned a key word, and I'll show some folks. Let me do this. Actually, let me not do that. Yeah, do this. So you said Old Vine, and we're going to talk about Old Vine in a second. But for those folks that actually have a couple of bottles of the Inspiration Vineyard Zinfandel in front of them right now, like I do, they acquired them via the SIP kit. And the SIP kit is your gateway to the next 4 or 5 Fridays in a row of pure entertainment, education, wine enjoyment. And there's a couple sleepers coming up, specifically from the Trujillo Vineyards, where we're going to be doing a retrospective tasting side by side, like we're doing this evening. So tonight we're tasting the 2018 Zinfandel, and we're tasting the 2016 Old Vine Zinfandel. And these are available right now. Interestingly enough, the 2018 is $29, and the Old Vine, 2 years older, is at 29 retail, is $50 retail. Two things. Let's talk first about Old Vine. So, not legally defined. What does it typically mean as it relates to Zinfandel?
So if you look at California history, and again, you're absolutely right, Martin, there is no legal definition of Old Vine. But if you look at California history, Zinfandel kind of came from the East Coast in around the 1820s, 1830s. And of course, we had a major event in California called the California Gold Rush, which was 1848. A lot of supplies were lacking, but what's great about Old Vine Zinfandel, or Zinfandel in general, is that Zinfandel vines can grow like little trees. And so what I thought I'd do is just kind of first show what a vine looks like after it's been pruned. And you can see that it looks like a little tree, which is easy to plant. You don't have to have a trellising system that can be expensive and require a lot of materials.
Wait, don't go anywhere yet.
Okay.
How old would that vine be right there?
This vine was on our Old Vine Zinfandel property. It was planted in the 1890s.
So you're going to make me do math.
1890s. Let's just
130.
Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah.
130 years of age. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and so this is like a little tree, and so that's part of why it is Old Vine. And if you look at the vineyards that were planted in and around the wine country in Sonoma County, wine country all the way from the Bay Area all the way up into the Sierra foothills where you have gold country, Italians immigrated up to the gold country to farm, to strike claims. And along the way, they had to have something to drink, so they planted vines. And so you're going to find old vines planted all the way up into the Sierras. You find them all the way up into Mendocino County because they realized that we could grow grapes, beautiful grapes in Sonoma County and Mendocino. And so these old vine vineyards are disappearing, but that's what makes it an old vine.
So you basically have a lot of luck in that with regards to, you have this Italian migration from the East Coast, and they are carrying plantings, and then they come to California for the gold rush, and they start planting Zinfandel up and down the coast. And for those of you that were on a couple of weeks back, we had Blue Rock, and we talked about the city of Asti, and you had the north of Cloverdale, I believe, up there, which was, what was it, John? Italian Swiss village, or?
It was called the Italian Swiss Colony. And if you didn't have a job, basically, and you landed in San Francisco on a boat, you had a relative that worked there and you were guaranteed a job. So you get on a bus, you go all the way down to the Alviso, which is the south of San Jose, and you come all the way back up, cross a couple bridges, and then you'd end up in Sonoma County, because we didn't have the Golden Gate Bridge then. But you just keep going north of Clover, actually between Cloverdale and Geyserville, and you have the town of Asti, and you've got Italian Swiss Colony. In fact, you know, do you have the poll of a famous presidential candidate who ran for president for many, many years in a row? He had a winery up in Asti. Are you aware of this statistic?
I am not.
Okay, well, we'll come back to it. I have to get his full name, but does anyone know, or can they answer by chat?
They can answer by chat.
I can give you a hint. He was always a presidential nominee, or not a nominee. He was a presidential candidate, and he was on the good old Laugh-In.
Oh, geez. Now we're dating ourselves. So essentially, these are old vine because these were one of the first varietals planted simply by the migration of Italian immigrants coming over to the New World and then coming west. And they just planted them, so they've been in the ground a lot longer.
And we got the answer is Pat Paulson, which is woohoo, we got it. That's, by the way, the answer to the question. Comedian Pat Paulson, and he had a winery.
Jeff and Jane Greasy, they may be professional sipsters and on the verge of retirement, but they know how to use a smartphone when it comes to trivia. So old vine, not legally defined. Old vine actually lucky, because if they had carried Cabernet over, Cabernet would be considered old vine because it's been planted for so long, but then someone had the genius of marketing it.
Well, it's partly that, and also partly because we also had another little happening here in California in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that was called Phylloxera. So Phylloxera, the little root louse, ate up a lot of the noble varietals, but a funny thing happened. The way in which Zinfandel was propagated, it seemed to have a natural Phylloxera resistance. It was hardy. It very rarely had powdery mildew, so it was actually pretty easy to plant and kind of neglect. The one problem with, there are really two little problems with Zinfandel. One is it's an uneven ripener. And I actually have a pretty good picture to show you how big the clusters are, because what can happen is you end up with these large clusters and they're uneven. And so you don't always get consistent ripening all at once with these large clusters. And sometimes you can end up with bunch rot. So Zinfandel was kind of tricky because it was easy to grow, but around harvest is usually when you have the most trouble with it. And that's when you wanted to get it off the vine as quickly as possible. So.
Well, in both of the pictures you've shown, and certainly in this Old Vine Zinfandel vineyard behind me, the first immediate thing one would notice is that there's no trellising. There's no wires, no stakes, no. So how on earth do you start this? And then when do you pull out all the stakes and say, let this thing just roam free?
So you basically plant a grape stake in the center and then train it just like a tree, or, basically along that grape stake. And then eventually, once the trunk is large enough, it doesn't need any additional support. And again, part of the reason why it was so attractive to the Italians during the gold rush period is that wires were very expensive. All of the stakes involved were very expensive. I mean, all of the materials that you would use to try to put in a proper trellis vineyard were really expensive during that time period. And they found that, you know, having an Old Vine Zinfandel head prune was actually pretty easy to plant and maintain, especially in rocky soils up in the Sierras, where it's also hard to even drive a stake in because you're dealing with that red clay soil. So,
no, that's actually pretty fascinating. So that you don't have a whole stake and trellis system, because back in the early 1900s, that was expensive. So let's pick a vine that has tremendous vigor, that doesn't necessarily need an exact climate, say like Pinot Noir or some of the cool climate grapes.
It can handle hot. Yeah.
It can handle hot, exactly. And so Zinfandel was the coup de grace in that capacity of just, this is an easy one. I love it. And I also like the fact that you can have red fruits, you can have black fruits. I mean, it has a really dynamic range. And when did you decide that you were going to A, have a vineyard, and then B, you wanted to make certain to pay homage to Zinfandel?
Well, okay. So, I mean, truth be told, in this case, my feeling about, I wanted to follow my passion and become a winemaker, and I loved wine and food. And so I started entertaining this idea with my former wife in the 90s, late 90s, and knew I loved Sonoma County. So we sold our house in the peninsula, moved up to Sonoma County, bought a 6-acre property. And we were really fortunate because the property had a 1-acre Old Vine Zinfandel in the front yard. And I affectionately called it the front yard Zinfandel. And the rest of the property was Chardonnay on a split trellis. So I lucked out in terms of having that fruit to work with, because it was already planted on the property. And here's the sad thing that everyone should know.
No, don't say it yet. Don't say it yet.
Okay,
I've got a picture of that. But I want you to show the picture of how long Zinfandel's been in your blood.
So it
goes back a few hundred years.
Yeah, it goes back a little ways. My great-grandfather was born in Chicago, by the way. Actually, my grandfather, I should say, was born in Chicago. My great-grandfather came here from what is now the Czech Republic, but he was really Bohemian, and he was an electrician, had a little farm in Wisconsin. My grandfather was born in Chicago. And when the 1906 earthquake hit, he knew it was time that he needed to come to California because there was a lot of work out here rebuilding buildings. He knew he wanted to live on a farm because he lived on a farm in Wisconsin and thought that was a healthy way of life. And so he bought property in San Martin, California, which is about 30 minutes south or 20 minutes south of San Jose. And he planted a Zinfandel vineyard because, again, that's what was widely planted in California in the early 1900s. And so this is a picture of a couple of my great uncles out there. My great aunt Emma is right here, and her sister Pauline is right here. And we think this is actually Boots. Boots was a guy that was showing my great grandfather how to grow grapes. He lived on a property next door, and he would also lease property from my great grandfather. And the other funny thing about Boots is he got his nickname, my mother says, because he was a bootlegger. So there you go, with Boots and my great aunts and uncles and great aunts. So that's kind of the story of it. Then a generation and came along and said, I love food, I love wine. IT is paying the bills, but I really want to dedicate myself to food and wine and travel and life. And that's how I started the winery.
I love it. Brett Saunders, sir, how are you doing? Thanks for joining. Scotland, I understand you are at your in-laws, so I retract the reference to opening up 2 bottles on a weeknight being called the Scotland. That is not at all true. The in-laws should strike that from memory. Don't worry about that. So let's get into these particular wines. So here's what I have in my glass right now, the 2018.
Okay. I'll put some.
And I also have in a glass right behind that, the Old Vine, and we'll talk about that in detail. But why don't we talked about the Italian heritage, and while you're pouring yourself a glass, I'll launch another poll question, because there seems to be a lot of confusion on this. Zinfandel's origin was discovered in 2001 via DNA testing at the UC Davis by a scientist named Carol Meredith. It is now known for fact to have originated where? Italy, Primitivo, Albania, or Croatia. Extra credit if you can all identify one of the wrong answers and the individual who chose it. We will end the polling now. And I'm interested, with the person who chose Primitivo, please stand up. I'm kidding. Croatia, this is the smart group. That is correct. Croatia is in fact the winner of where Zinfandel is from. And it's actually good to then go into Google Earth, because I can show people Primitivo is a close guess, but it's not the closest guess. So if we look at where Croatia is, you can see, I'll pause right there. It is not from Western Europe where Zinfandel comes from. And, where everything else comes from, for that matter. When you think about Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Franc, etc., nope, not there. It comes from Croatia. And interestingly enough, you'll see obviously what Croatia has that we always talk about for a major wine region. It has proximity to a maritime influence. So it is a very, very growing wine region. And it's an explosive wine region now, based upon the discovery of Zinfandel being from Croatia in 2001. So not too dissimilar from a launching trajectory standpoint that the United States enjoyed during the Judgment of Paris in 1976, when it was determined by the French accidentally that, lo and behold, America can make great wine, and that catapulted America on the wine scene. You now have Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, all exploding in wine popularity because of this discovery in 2001 by Carol Meredith out of the UC Davis, and also two Croatian scientists. An interesting fun fact, which I'll share more in a little segment that we're introducing tonight called Things You Didn't Know. Ridge Vineyards helped fund this study, and Ridge Vineyards is one of the pioneers in Zinfandel. So it's interesting that they funded the origin study to determine where is this from, and lo and behold, it is from Croatia. Now, as John talked about with regards to the migration of Italian immigrants in the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast, it's not too difficult to see how Italy has Primitivo all over Italy, coming from Croatia for the most part. And so this is also not a big leap to recognize that Primitivo and Zinfandel genetically are the same. And when you think about America believing that Zinfandel was its own grape, it really was not. It is Primitivo, but it didn't originate in Italy. It originated in Croatia. However, fun fact, America can claim the name Zinfandel. So we did invent that name. But now back to wine region, buckle up. Again, a body of water. Everywhere we go around great wine in the world, there's a maritime influence. And this one is especially important because John talked a little bit ago. Here's Napa, here's Sonoma, but he also mentioned Asti. And when you see how far north it is up there, and it was grown a large point because the Swiss Italian colony, here's Geyserville, here's Cloverdale. So Mr. Phillips, Rand McNally Jr. said it was right between the two cities, and he is precisely correct. This is where you had a ton of Zinfandel grown.
And it's actually on the west side of 101, my friend.
Then take that up with Google Maps or Google Earth. This is not Martin Cody. This is, you know what? It probably took me to the Asti Winery.
It did. If you go,
Yep.
If you travel on the left side of 101, it's all vineyard property.
If I'm coming south, it is the left side of 101.
Yeah.
But let's go taste with John at Inspiration, because John has a tasting room right off 101 that I have had the distinct pleasure of walking into, both announced and unannounced, on more than a dozen occasions. And it is, I'll pull out a little bit, I mean, it is minutes from 101. Here's 101 right here. And so you just get off, a couple turns. I'm sorry. Here's 101 right here. Boom, into the Inspiration tasting room. And John, tell people that, because I'm going to show them exactly what it is. I mean, this is a full production facility.
It is, yeah.
So it is the Inspiration Vineyards.
There you go.
And on the inside, you have tanks, barrels, everything. And then on the inside, unless you've remodeled, when you go in and take a left, you've got the tasting facility, the salon, all of the tables. You actually might have a picture, but it is a very easy place to go in and taste. And then you are seconds away from where John was talking about earlier, his old house right there. It's probably about a 7-minute drive if you miss the light or stop sign and there's traffic. But the sadness that John was referring to is the Old Vine Vineyard. And I'll show you a picture of John pruning vines here in this Old Vine Vineyard. You can see was torn out when John sold his house. And that was in, I think, 2018 or 2019.
Yeah, we sold the house. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You've got a new Google picture. Yeah, that was 2018, I think.
So now this actually
that's a 2019 photo. Yeah, they just put in the new planting stakes.
So yeah, actually down here, April 2019. This is it's a stake to my heart. I can't only imagine what John feels, but I nicknamed this location here, You're Drinking History. Because if you have the 2016 Old Vine Zinfandel vines that are 128 years of age, it is history. There's no more of it. You can't get it. They ripped out the vineyard. It'll never be made again. So it's a pretty darn special bottle, and the wine speaks for itself. But I want to get back, and it looks like you're going to share something.
Yeah, I was actually going to try. I was going to show one thing. Yeah, so we no longer, the sign is also no longer on the property. I brought it back to the winery, so we're it is what it is. It's really kind of sad, but I'll to show two pictures, because I don't think I showed this yet. This when I was farming the property about 2 years before we sold it. This is how beautiful this property looked. Hold on, where are you? There we go. And I just love this photo because you can see how lovely that is, right? It's a gorgeous part of the property or part of the world. And we had views of out those windows of the west, so we could see sunsets that were just amazing, fiery red.
I still think it's just amazing that there's no trellising. Those things just grow. Yeah. And you just let them do what they're going to do.
And you talked about economics and the cost differences between the two bottles. I'll come back and show the pruning picture again, because this is a labor-intensive affair. The yields on these vines are very low. That's one reason why the new owner, who no one really, I won't even mention his name, but I got to tell you, I had lunch today with a couple of winemakers, and they brought him up, and he's not thought highly of in Sonoma County. He's also an Australian, so hopefully there are no Australians.
That didn't take long.
Yeah, no. So anyway, he put Pinot in. Now there's a glut of Pinot. He said that these vines couldn't make any money, and I'm like, but you don't realize that you can sell a bottle of wine from these vines for $50 because there's so little of it planted, and you can make the same amount of money if you put in new Pinot. It's ridiculous. One other picture I wanted to show, because you brought it up, and I thought it's a cool thing. And that's this picture, Martin, which is, this is what it looks like during harvest when we're producing the wines. So you can see it's chock full of fermenters, open fermenters there. I'm actually standing on top of an open fermenter that's about 4 feet high and doing punch downs. And if you fall in, you fall in. But this is how full the winery will get during harvest, is when we're doing full production. So again, all of our wines are handmade wines. We make wine for other people. It's a very labor intensive, but very fun process. It's a labor of love. So
yeah, that's a full house right there.
And then the last picture, again, going back to talking about intensity, because they're head prune vines, each cane has to be hand cut, and you have to make decisions about where you cut and how many buds you leave on the vine or on the cane. And so again, this is part of the reason why there's a lot of labor involved, but at the same time, this is also why you have intensity of the fruit, because you don't have a lot of fruit to work with. So you get really intense, rich fruit. So these are the little buds. This is where the canes will grow. So you have 3 canes that will come out, 3 positions. What we're also calling this is a vertical shoot position, meaning that we want our canes to grow up vertically as opposed to sideways. So what may happen is I'll come along and I might thin cane or thin the shoots. But if I made a mistake and cut off this in a place that damaged this bud, then I won't get a new cane, and then that's kind of it for that arm. So again, one reason why there's a little bit more labor involved, but all of those vines I got to know and had a personal relationship with, and I kind of miss them because I'm not there anymore.
So each one of those little spurs, how many spurs would be on one of those crazy gnarly old vines?
You're shooting for, I'm going to share a screen. You're shooting for about 8. So if you look here, you've got probably, we've got probably about 12. So 8 to 12. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 13, 14. That one. This is my favorite vine. So it had a little bit more. It could handle more vigor. Some of these only had 4. You can see these. And the other thing, notice this one's really small to the ground, where this one's a large one. That's another part about how the Italians planted these vineyards. They're not all Zinfandel. One of the terms that is an Italian term that kind of means a mutt, a derogatory term that Italians used against other Italians, Udego, and that kind of meant that you're kind of a half-breed, meaning, not that smart. But Dago really also referred to something that's not 100%. And some of you that are older may be familiar with the term Dago Red. It was an Italian blend red wine term used for many years, the 60s and 70s. And it's funny, when I used to do tours of the property, how I would get someone that was, in 10, 15 years younger than me, had never heard of the term. Well, back when the Italians started planting these vines, they also started planting a few other varieties mixed into it. Alicante Pichet, Carignan. Sometimes they would plant Burger, which is a white grape that has tons of fruit, large globe cluster fruit that's white, but produces so much juice. But when you mix it all together, and that Alicante has that blood red cut Alicante skin as Zinfandel berry, looks like it's that. It's just a very blood red. You mix them all together, you had a Dago Red. You had a red wine year after year. And so there's also that richness and complexity to this wine because it also has a field blend of these different grapes. And that's kind of a thing about my vineyard. And that's why if you go back to the 16 Old Vine and you're tasting that and compare that with the 18 Galloway Zinfandel, you're going to already see that white pepper, that cardamom, some spiciness like some cloves, but also there's
right. You're jumping ahead. No jumping ahead. That's going to be on the take-home quiz. So
okay,
go back to the picture with the spur close-up.
Okay, you got it.
Please.
Spur close-up. Boom.
All right, now the ends of these where they have been cut, the spurs, is that just discoloring from season out? Yeah, up there, it looks burnt.
So what happens is when you cut a vine, it bleeds. And in this case, what it's bleeding is water and sap.
And sap, yep, okay. And
So
then it just hardens and discolors
and then it hardens and seals. Yeah.
Interesting. Part of its own little healing system, like a scab.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. All right. Now I would like everybody, if you would like to turn your cameras on, please feel free to turn on. Look at Chad Angelo. Dried sap heals itself. Actually, it was one of my nicknames in high school. Dried sap heals itself. So I do want to go back as people are turning their cameras on. I will share the, I hope, the Cellar Angels preferred pricing of these wines. All right. So we have the sip kit, as I told you, has got the coming attractions coming up, and there's a bunch in there. We have some from Trujillo, and then we also have a Pinot Noir festival that's going to be interesting with the Waxwing. But these two wines that we're tasting tonight, $29, $45. And so, John, you just talked about some of the labor involved in the 2016 Estate Old Vine. You can't get it any longer. So you're drinking liquid history, never be made again, unfortunately. And it takes a tremendous amount of labor to prune these vines. You get lower yield. Is that what constitutes the price difference?
Yeah, I mean, because it's wine that I produced from grapes that I grew, it's the labor involved, it's scarcity. I'm only making, in this case, I think the 16 vintage, I put on the back of the bottle, we did, let's see, how many cases does it? Oh, 50 cases. So we did 2 barrels of this wine, and that was all the vineyard produced. And then one reason why the 18 Galloway is less expensive is that, one, it's newer vines. 2, the grower is a very good friend of mine and gave me a terrific price break on the wine. So that was another way I could pass on savings to you, because I've known the grower for a long time. It's a hillside vineyard, it's been planted now about 20 years ago. So it's not considered old vine. I think it was actually planted in, about 2001-ish, 2002. So it's still relatively young compared to my 2016.
And just a couple of highlights. Jim Brubaker, if that's not a screensaver, that looks fantastic behind you. Good weather out in Colorado. Chad Angelo, why aren't you outside? You're also in Colorado. I don't understand, but
working.
So I'm going on to the Old Vine Zinfandel. I'd be curious what people think of. There we go, Scotland. The acidity on the Old Vine Zin is amazing. It gives it a real freshness. I was just going to ask what some of the tasting notes people had on either of the Zins.
Yeah, I'm
Julie
curious
Porter,
what you'll
we got
think.
to say hi to you. Hello.
I mean, I think as a winemaker, the first thing I'm trying to do is produce wines that complement food. And the second thing I'm trying to do is control alcohol. The Dry Creek fruit came in a little hot at 15.5%, which is, again, typical for Zinfandel because it is an uneven ripener, and this is a warm vineyard site. My Russian River Old Vine, cooler vineyard site, I was able to keep the alcohol in check and pick it a little bit earlier and get it down to 13.5%. So I prefer wines that are under 14, both for drinking and for food pairing. And you'll also find that wines that are in that range generally have lower pHs and higher acids, which again, complement food better. But when you're talking about awards, and trying to get awards for wines, you'll also sometimes find that Zinfandels that are higher in pH, lower in acid will also win more awards, simply because I think it tricks the palate.
Interesting. And so 13.5 on the Old Vine. Mm-hmm. And you said 15?
It's 15.5 on the 18 Galloway.
Yowzers, you're right. That did come in a little hot.
So don't age it. Drink it now with
Yeah.
pizza.
What would you, I was just going to ask you, what would you pair with the Galloway at 15 and a half?
Pulled pork, barbecued pulled pork, smoked pulled pork. Pizza, especially if you've got a wood-fired pizza oven, go for it. Tracy's, my fiance's favorite pizza right now is pepperoni and green olive pizza, and it goes really well with that. I can tell you that. So the burgers, it's just a casual everyday drinker, not very sophisticated. You
don't feel the heat.
No.
At 15 and a half. So it's very well balanced from that capacity, because normally at 15 and a half, I'm conditioned that if I see that on the label and I go to take a sip, I'm like, this is probably going to be hot. But there's none of that there.
So that I won't give the answer out, does anyone have, unless you read some of the tasting notes, does anyone have the a good descriptor on what they're getting on the Galloway in terms of flavor profile?
Well, I like Mark Salazar's suggestion that spicy Mexican food with high al.
Yeah, Mexican food is great. I make a chicken enchilada that I just love with this. Lots of chipotle. If any of you ever make it to Sonoma County and you visit our website, you'll also notice that I do a lot of wine and food experiences, and so I'll do private little lunches for 4 under our gazebo in downtown Santa Rosa, and I'm always having fun with different food pairings for people. So,
what would you do with the Old Vine?
So, Old Vine,
other than just have a glass, turn on some smooth music, tell everyone to be quiet because you're drinking history.
My favorite pairings for Old Vine are wild game, and if I don't have wild game, then it's either duck or the other spectrum, lamb. So just to share a quick story, I have time to share another story?
Please.
Okay, so
we're on, the network's allowed us to go for 2 more hours.
Okay, good. So my fiance and I bought a house in northern Burgundy. And so, of course, they're not familiar with these wines. And, they're familiar with some Italian wines, but actually the French don't drink a lot of wine from Italy. They drink a lot of wine from France. And so when the first summer that we spent some time there, I took a case of the Old Vine. I took mostly Old Vine with me because they're not used to it, and it's something that is really our history, and I thought that they'd get a kick out of it. And one of our guys in the village, he cuts wood for a living, and he passed away actually within the last couple of years, or just after I met him. But he would bring wood in the back of his tractor for me to unload in the back of my house for the winter. And on the second wood delivery, we were chatting a little bit, and he spoke no English. And so my limited chatting in French, and he hands me this paper wrapped package and hands it to me, and it's as a gift, just generous gift. And I thank him and I ask him what it is, and he says Sanglier. And Sanglier is wild boar. And I have to tell you that cooking that wild boar and having some Old Vine Zinfandel was probably one of the best pairings I've ever had in my entire life. It was amazing. And I go on record, this is a wine for wild game. It just screams it. So there you go.
I love it. And I quite honestly don't have enough wild game in my diet. I think I'm not the only person that can say that.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed. June 21st, we'll be back, and I can start enjoying some of the wild game and all the other foods around our village. So it's pretty cool.
Do you always see, and people have asked us this question, when you have these old vine vineyards like the one behind me, and you see these gaps in between the rows and stuff like that, what happened there?
So there are 2 things that are probably going on. And I think if you showed the overhead of my vineyard, you'll also see that as well. So sometimes you end up with some of the variation could just be the vigor because of the soil. So the vines themselves are smaller in that part of the vineyard than they are in other parts of the vineyard. So you might have a part of the vineyard that's more vigorous and therefore more canopy. In our case, it was a combination of vigor and die-off. You could have die-off because the vine just eventually does die. You could have die-off. There's a very severe, if you get someone that's a klutz in a tractor, there's a very severe disease called tractor blight. It's when the tractor takes out a vine. That does happen every year with old vines, especially because, it's not too uncommon to nip a vine with an implement because, again, you're not dealing with these clean rows with wires and trellises that you also have to worry about.
In Wisconsin, the Division of Motor Vehicles calls that inattentive driving, and it's a $95 fine.
My next door neighbor routinely would take out a post and wires with his vineyard because he was an airline pilot. I made a comment. I would never fly with him, and he was flying for United for many years until he retired. And I was like, I'm not getting an airplane with him. I've seen him drive a tractor.
Yeah,
no,
that's not good. It's not good. Well, I do know that after this evening, Jim might be going Brubaker to play it against sports for a pellet rifle to take out the rabbit in his yard and try it with wild game. So I'm a big fan of that. I do want to take 2 minutes and share some things with regards to, we're introducing a segment that we want to call Things You Didn't Know. So we teased this a little bit earlier with regards to where Zinfandel came from. And it is, in fact, DNA tested by UC Davis with both Carol Meredith and 2 scientists from Croatia. What you may not know is that Carol is married to a gentleman named Steve Zeiger, and the Zeiger Meredith Vineyard, she's now a winemaker in Napa Valley. They have a Zinfandel that is $45 a bottle. So not only was she a pioneer in discovering the origin of Zinfandel, she now produces a Zinfandel. And I talked a little bit about Ridge Vineyards. Ridge funded this study at UC Davis, or part of it. And what they have done, there is another grape or varietal that is the cousin, if you will, of Zinfandel. It is so genetically close. It's called Carignac castellinus. Carignac, actually, the C can be also pronounced like a Z, so it sounds a little bit like Zinfandel. And a third grape called Pribidig. Ridge has planted all 3 of these, and they are doing a study. They've planted 1,500 vines in the year 2015. They've started to harvest. Their first wine is going to be available, I think it's the 29th vintage, so it might be available now. But it's fascinating to see that if they've grown it over in Croatia, Ridge has now brought these plantings over to the United States. They planted 1,500 vines, and so they are actually helping foster in a new generation of wine, very much like we experienced in 1976. Hungary, Serbia, Croatia are now experiencing, and so Ridge is bringing it all back to the United States. Pretty interesting things as it relates to Zinfandel. John, should Zinfandel always be thick, unctuous, and 16% alcohol?
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, again, another story. When I was in college, first discovering Zinfandel. In fact, I'm trying to think if I was working for Mirasu at the time, and I might. Yeah, no, I was working for Mirasu. I had just moved out, but I was house sitting for my parents, and I opened up my dad's closet in the kitchen, and I saw this big jug of Almaden Zinfandel. And I had a friend over, and I said, you know what, let's have some pizza. Let's have a little bit of Zinfandel. This is inexpensive jug wine. And I pulled out the cork, and I poured my wine, and I taste it. I'm like, this is a jug Zinfandel? It was 13 alcohol, rich flavors, good acidity, good balance. It went well with dinner. So over the course of the week, I finished the jug. I was by myself too, and I was drinking. And my dad gets home, calls me up after I was house sitting, so I went back to my place. He calls me up and he goes, "Hey, I'm looking around my closet in the kitchen. Where did that jug of Almaden Zinfandel go?" And I said, "Oh, Dad, oh my God. I have to tell you, I was shocked. It's one of the best Zinfandels I've ever had. It was well balanced, yada, yada." He's like, "I've been aging that wine for 10 years. So
Oh, you're gonna be pleased to know, Dad. I had it with a college buddy with some
Oh,
pizzas.
so good. But I
And then
can
we
tell
polished
you,
off a 12 pack and went out.
I can tell you that, back then, when there was a ton of Zinfandel planted, they were making it right and they're making it well. And, we started inching up the alcohols for all the other reasons. But no, you can make a really good wine in that 13% range. When I'm in France, almost all the wines I'm drinking are in that 13%. In fact, my palate is destroyed for at least a month when I get home. Everything I taste when I get home is hot. I cannot handle it because I'm so used to, once I get in France and I'm there, I'm used to drinking 12.5 to 13.5%. So it's funny how, again, I much prefer that wine. It's so much better food wine.
On the 16, and I did not do this, but I'd be curious if you would decant this prior to enjoying this 16, and if so, how long? I'm decanting mine in my glass.
Yeah, it will throw sediment. So if you're going to serve the whole bottle in one night, I would probably decant it. If you're, I used my Corbin tonight because I'm taking these 2 bottles to some winemakers or friends that own the Merlot vineyard that we're now working with tomorrow for dinner. And you talk about a beautiful property. Theirs is gorgeous. And, I get my vineyard fix sitting at their place. But I would say, if you're going to serve the whole bottle, go for it. Otherwise, I don't know if it's necessary. It's opening up nicely while we're talking. And it's one reason why I like the Corbin, because I can protect it. I can just have a glass and then I can have something else. I don't have to open every single bottle. I can have multiple bottles open and enjoy them.
I like it. I'm a big fan of Zinfandels that are not hot. I'm a big fan of Zinfandels that are very well balanced, that have the fruit component. Obviously, the 18 has more fruit forwardness to it. It's livelier. You can feel it. It's very light on its feet. There's a lot going on in the 16, and that's a fun wine to explore from. And I'm looking at the bottles just because it's a special bottle of wine. I get almost sentimental every time I open one of these, knowing that it might be the last time I open one of these, because it's just so.
17 was our last vintage, and I'm hoarding the few cases I still have left. Yeah, it's tough.
It's really but tough. You feel that dark brooding fruit in the 16, that not caramelly, but it has some freshness to it on the dark fruits. Not a lot of red fruits, but definitely dark fruits. And if anybody has a question for John, by all means, you can unmute, and I know Chad usually always has a question, but I don't want to put him on the spot. I just want to drink. No questions. It's an easy crowd. How do you, with Mother Nature and climate change being a little aggressive in the last 5 to 10 years, how do you control the alcohol to balance that with ripeness?
Well, there are a few ways. In the vineyard, you try to develop more canopy. You try to give more water. You try to pick earlier. Those are all the things that you try to slow everything down. The interesting thing about grapes is that it wants to produce sugar. That's what makes it an ideal canvas to make wine, because it loves to produce sugar. And it's one of the only fruits that we work with that has both juice and enough sugar to produce an alcoholic product that doesn't spoil, right? That can get up to 13, 14% alcohol. So without having to add additional sugar. I think the only thing that doesn't spoil is honey. So mead is the only wine you can make without spoilage, but you have to still add water to make mead. So that's what's kind of cool about making wine from grapes. So the only way to really control it is either in the vineyard, picking early, or on the back end. Once you make the wine, you can have alcohol removed. And that's it. And what's really funny is that you can end up with really hot weather. And this is what's going to be a test over the next, 5-10 years, and see what changes climate will have on winemaking and quality winemaking. Because ultimately, we're going to be in a situation where you'll have wine with sugar, or grapes with sugar, but you don't have flavor. The depth of flavor comes from hang time. That comes from that long extended ripening. And as the seeds start to turn brown, you get the flavors in the grapes. So it's a real fine balancing act of when to pick, because you can get the sugar, but you want flavor. And that's the tricky.
And on the 16 and on the 17, since it was the final vintage ever made from this vineyard, can you age this? What's the staying power of this, or what's the longevity?
So my very first vintage off the property when I became a winemaker was 2002, and I'm still enjoying 2002 now. I've had I had a 2002 last year, and it was still quite alive. So that's also been kind of fun watching it. Some vintages definitely have better flavor profiles than other vintages. From the time that I was on the property, I had one vintage that I didn't make. And I want to say that was 2010, I think. And that's because 2010 had a really hot growing year. I'm sorry, back up. 2010 had a really cold growing year, and it was just cold all summer long. And so everything was behind. I think it was 10 or 11. And then all of a sudden we ended up with 5 days of 105-degree heat.
Yep.
And the berries were little green berries. They hadn't yet started to go through veraison and turn color. And so when we had this intense 105-degree heat for like 5 days, everything was burnt. Everything turned into these little black rocks. And so it's called necropsy of the vine. And it literally browned off all the stems. No more nutrition was going to the grapes. And so we really ended up with very little, no fruit. I had a friend come through with a bucket. He made 5 gallons of wine from the vineyard, just from the second crop. And he gave me a couple bottles, and that was it.
It was 2010. There was 3 days in September that were over 100 degrees, scorched a third of the vineyard in Carneros. And fun fact, fun story, I asked a very, very famous winemaker off camera, what do you do in that scenario? What do you do when you lose a third of your crop in the span of 3 days? And this individual said, we do what we always do. We sell it to La Crema.
Ooh. Well,
I'm just the messenger, people. Send all letters to the info@Cellar Angels. Go ahead, John.
I was going to say there are two funny things, and then Chad, absolutely, I'll quickly. In 2010, I made one of the best Cabernet Sauvignons I ever made in my life. Again, because of the cold growing season, but it was at the perfect point when the heat came on. And 2010 was also one of the most difficult years to sell Cabernet Sauvignon because it tasted like green bell pepper. It was tons. And all of a sudden people started tasting my wine going, wow, these are beautiful. And you know what? I still have some 10s, they're beautiful. The next thing is this year, 3 days wiped out probably 70% of the grapes in France because of frost. Again,
we talked about that a couple weeks ago.
So Chad, you were going to ask a question.
Mr. Angelo.
Yes. No, the alcohol is with the Zinfandel. I've made Mendocino Zinfandels, and keeping the alcohol in check where it doesn't go above that 15 and a half is key. But I'm one that loves that really jammy component that gets, and then it accentuates food with a char from the grill. So you get that sweet jammy with the kind of toasty, char, nutty flavor. It really mixes well together.
You're making me hungry, young man. And for those of you that don't know Chad Angelo, that's Chad Angelo, owner and winemaker of Angelo Cellars. So winemaker talk here with Cellar Angels on a Friday night sip, getting ready on the eve of summer. Mr. Phillips, this has been a wealth of knowledge, and we are indebted. We are mournful that we lost this vineyard, but we are celebrating what we have in the glass from it. So, the earth giving back to us to enjoy and say thanks to everything, the bounty that the earth can provide as long as we take care of it. I do want to let people know that we have got some bubbles in store next week with Anna Keller. We're going to be discussing certain types of sparkling wine production. And then also we're going to go to somewhat of a summer schedule coming up in a couple of weeks where we are be flip-flopping some dates, because we know that as everything starts to open up on a Friday night, you may want to get out and go see some people that you haven't seen in a year or more. And we are going to be adjusting the schedule to reflect that, ourselves included. So I want to say thank you to John Phillips, who has graciously taught us a little bit about Zinfandel and certainly more about everything that happens in his vineyards and how he does things. And John, by the way, is going to France June 21st. And I know there's an open door policy at his place in France. He may not know it, but I'm certain there is.
Can't wait.
Honestly, I walked into his tasting room a bunch of times in Santa Rosa. We can do the same thing in France. It's completely allowed over there.
You know what?
It's
Yeah,
not even,
no problem.
it's not
No
even
problem at all.
trespassing.
We got a spare bedroom and we've got lots of food. So yeah.
See, there you go. I just thought about walking in and now I've got a place to stay. Nothing wrong with that. That's what I like. And we all do. So all of you, be good to one another. Keep drinking great wine. Enjoy the luxury life of Cellar Angels. Thank you so much for all the support.